Miles GhostHunter here, and I need you to listen to me very carefully before we begin. There is a journal, a small private journal kept by a woman named Susan Powell in West Valley City, Utah. In that journal, among the grocery lists and the notes about her children's doctor appointments, she wrote a single sentence that should have saved her life. __quote _0 ___. The police read that sentence, the courts read that sentence, social workers, attorneys, judges, and child welfare officers all read that sentence, and not one of them stopped what happened next. This is episode 4. This is Susan Powell, and this is the case that broke every single safety net the American justice system claims to have. Before we go into the darkness of what happened, I need you to understand who Susan Cox Powell actually was. Not the missing woman on the news ticker, not the face on the flyer, the living, breathing person. Susan was born on October 16, 1981, in Alameda County, California. She grew up in a family that meant everything to her. Her parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, raised Susan and her siblings with a kind of steadiness that you could feel the moment you walked into their home. Chuck was a quiet man with a backbone of iron. Judy was warmth and discipline in equal measure. Susan took after both of them. She was the kind of person who left handwritten notes in her friends' mailboxes for no reason. Birthday cards that arrived on time, every single year. She volunteered at her church. She taught Sunday school to 5-year-olds who adored her. She baked cookies for new neighbors before they finished unpacking their moving boxes. Susan met Joshua Powell at a church gathering in 2000. She was 19, he was 21. Friends from that period will tell you that Josh seemed quiet, polite, a little intense but nothing alarming. He attended services. He spoke about wanting a family. Susan saw a man who shared her faith, and she married him on April 6, 2001. Their first son, Charlie, was born in 2004. Their second son, Braden, followed in 2006. Susan threw herself into motherhood with the same energy she put into everything else. She kept a schedule on the refrigerator. Monday was library day. Wednesday was park day. She cut their sandwiches into shapes because Charlie once said triangles tasted better than squares. But behind that refrigerator schedule, behind the Sunday school lessons and the birthday cards, something was rotting. Susan's journal tells a different story than the family photographs. She started writing in it consistently around 2008, and what fills those pages is a slow, meticulous record of a marriage disintegrating under the weight of one man's control. Josh Powell controlled the money. Susan had to account for every dollar. He gave her a weekly allowance that barely covered groceries. When she asked for more, he told her she was irresponsible. When she suggested she get a job to help the family, he told her that a good wife stays home. He controlled the schedule. Dinner had to be ready at a specific time. The house had to be cleaned to his standards. When it wasn't, he didn't raise a hand. Not at first. He dismantled her with words. He told her she was incapable. He told her she couldn't do anything right. He told her that no one else would ever want her. She wrote about the cold. Josh kept the thermostat set to 55 degrees Fahrenheit in the middle of Utah winter. Susan and the boys wore coats inside the house. She asked him to turn the heat up. He said they couldn't afford it. Meanwhile, he spent hundreds on camping equipment he used once and computer parts she never saw assembled into anything. And then there was his father. Stephen Craig Powell lived in Puyallup, Washington, and from the moment Susan married Josh, Stephen's behavior toward his daughter-in-law crossed a line that should have triggered alarms in anyone paying attention. He made comments about her appearance. He told Josh, in front of Susan, that she was, quote, one. He wrote poems about her. He took photographs of her without her knowledge. Susan told Josh about his father's behavior. Josh's response was silence, or worse, deflection. __quote _2 ___. By late 2008, Susan had made a decision. She was going to leave. She consulted with a divorce attorney. She began setting money aside, small amounts, hidden in an account Josh didn't know about. She updated her will, and in that will, she included a provision that would later become the most haunting document in the entire case. She wrote that in the event of her passing, Josh should not receive her life insurance. She wrote that she did not trust him. And she wrote the sentence I read to you at the beginning. If I die, it may not be an accident, even if it looks like one. She wrote that in 2008. She disappeared on December 6, 2009, 14 months later. The warning was on paper. It was notarized. It was legal. It existed. And it changed nothing. December 6, 2009, a Sunday, West Valley City, Utah. The temperature outside dropped below freezing after sunset. By midnight, it was in the low 20s. Susan's co-worker at Wells Fargo, a woman named Giovanna Owings, expected to see Susan at work on Monday morning. Susan never missed work. She was the person who covered other people's shifts. She was the person who showed up 15 minutes early and left 15 minutes late. Monday morning came. Susan's desk was empty. Giovanna called Susan's cell phone. No answer. She called again. No answer. She called Josh. Josh answered. He sounded calm, flat. He said Susan was not home. He did not say where she was. He did not sound concerned. Giovanna called the police. When officers from the West Valley City Police Department arrived at the Powell home on Sarah Circle, what they found inside that house made no sense. The front door was locked. Josh answered it with Braden on his hip. Charlie was nearby. Both boys were dressed, which was unusual for a Monday morning when they were supposed to be in daycare. Inside the house, 2 large fans were running on the floor of the living room, industrial-sized fans, pointed at the carpet. In December, in Utah, with the heat set to 55 degrees, the carpet was wet. Officers asked Josh where his wife was. Josh said he didn't know. He said he'd taken the boys camping the night before. Officers asked him where. He said Simpson Springs, a recreation area in the Tooele County desert, roughly an hour and a half southwest of their home. An officer asked Josh if he understood that it was December, that the temperature at Simpson Springs the previous night had been below 0. Josh said the boys had fun. An officer asked Josh what time they left. Josh said around midnight. An officer asked when they returned. Josh said around 8 in the morning. An officer asked where Susan was when they left. Josh said she was home. An officer asked if Susan had said where she was going. Josh said no. An officer pointed at the fans, asked why they were running. Josh said there had been a spill. He didn't say what kind of spill. He said he was cleaning it up. The spill, the fans, the wet carpet in a freezing house. A midnight camping trip with a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old in sub-zero temperatures. A wife who never missed work, never missed a call, never missed a day of making triangle sandwiches for her sons, gone without a word. And Josh Powell standing in his living room, calm as stone, saying he didn't know where she was. The investigation began immediately, and from the first hour, every single detective working the case reached the same conclusion. Josh Powell had done something to his wife. The problem was proving it. West Valley City Police executed a search warrant on the Powell home within days. What they found expanded the picture but didn't complete it. Susan's purse was in the house. Her wallet was in the house. Her cell phone was in the house. Her car keys were in the house. Her car was in the garage. Her coat was in the closet. In December, in Utah, with temperatures below freezing, no woman walks out of her house in the middle of a Utah winter without her coat, her phone, her wallet, or her car. Nobody does that. Not voluntarily. Not if they're alive and making their own choices. Forensic teams processed the house. The wet spot on the carpet yielded trace evidence. Luminol testing revealed cleaning patterns consistent with someone attempting to remove biological material. The fans had been running for hours, possibly longer, drying the carpet before anyone arrived, but there was no body. And without a body, the case hit a wall that would define every agonizing year that followed. Josh Powell was named a person of interest within weeks. Not a suspect, a person of interest. The distinction matters because of what it allows and what it prevents. A person of interest can be questioned but not compelled, followed but not detained, watched but not charged. And Josh knew it. He hired an attorney. He stopped cooperating with the police. He moved the boys into a new residence and began constructing a narrative that he would repeat with variations. For the next 2 years, the narrative was this: Susan was troubled. Susan was unhappy. Susan may have run off with another man. Susan may have abandoned her family. Josh was the victim here, a loving father left to raise 2 boys alone while his wife selfishly disappeared. He went on television. He sat in a chair with his hands folded and told reporters that he missed Susan, that he hoped she would come home, that he was praying for her return. He was not telling the truth. Everyone watching sensed it. But sensing and proving are 2 different countries, and the border between them is made of evidence. The police leaned into what they had. They pulled Josh's cell phone records. They pulled his credit card statements. They pulled the GPS data from his vehicle. What they found didn't prove minivan told its own story. When police examined it, they found trace evidence in the vehicle. They found that the passenger seat had been moved to a position inconsistent with Susan sitting in it. They found chemical indicators, but they did not find Susan. Detectives interviewed Josh's neighbors. Several reported seeing Josh loading items into his minivan late on the night of December 6th. One neighbor specifically recalled the sound of the garage door opening and closing multiple times between 11 at night and midnight. The boys were already in the van. It was dark, it was cold, and Josh was making trips between the house and the vehicle. 1 trip, 2 trips, 3 trips. Nobody counted exactly, but multiple trips carrying things in the dark before driving into the desert with his children. The investigation expanded outward. Search teams were deployed to Simpson Springs and the surrounding desert. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Ground penetrating radar was used on sections of desert floor. Mine shafts in the area were explored because the region around Simpson Springs is dotted with abandoned mines, some of them hundreds of feet deep, some of them impossible to fully search. Nothing. No clothing, no jewelry, no remains. The desert held its silence. Josh continued his performance. He gave interviews. He maintained his innocence. He criticized the police for focusing on him instead of looking for Susan. He filed a missing persons report, which investigators noted he had not done on the morning she disappeared. His co-worker called the police. Not Josh. Never Josh. And inside that silence, inside the gap between what everyone believed and what anyone could prove, the boys were growing up. Charlie was 4 when his mother disappeared. Braden was 2. They lived with their father. They saw him every day. They heard his version of events every day. And slowly, over the months that followed, they began to say things. Not to Josh, not to his family, to other people. Daycare workers, church volunteers, family friends. Small things at first, fragments that a 4-year-old could offer. Charlie told a daycare worker that they went camping and Mommy came with them. He said it plainly. The way children say things that they don't yet understand are important. He described his mother being in the vehicle, lying down. He drew pictures. In one drawing there was a van with 3 people in the front and 1 person in the back. The person in the back was lying down. Charlie identified the 3 people as himself, Braden, and Daddy. He identified the person lying down as Mommy. When investigators learned about these statements, the legal and ethical machinery of the case ground forward another inch. But an inch is not a mile. The statements of a 4-year-old are not admissible in most courts without extensive corroboration. A child's drawing is not a confession. A child's words are not a warrant. And Josh knew that too. In the months following Susan's disappearance, Josh Powell made a decision that would later prove to be one of the most consequential moves in the case. He packed up his sons and moved from Utah to Washington State. He moved into his father's house, Stephen Powell's house. The same Stephen Powell who had been writing poetry about Susan. The same Stephen Powell who had taken photographs of Susan without her consent. The same Stephen Powell whose obsession with his daughter-in-law had been documented in Susan's journal for years. Josh moved his 2 young sons into that house. The West Valley City Police Department watched Josh leave their jurisdiction. Utah investigators could still work the case, but the daily surveillance, the proximity, the pressure that comes from a detective being able to drive past your house on the way to the office, that was gone. Josh knew what he was doing. He was putting distance between himself and the people who were trying to build a case against him. Washington State, Puyallup. Stephen Powell's house on a quiet street. Josh and the boys moved in, and for a brief period the public story went quiet. The case was still open. The searches continued. But the news cycle moved on, and then Stephen Powell's world detonated. In September 2011, nearly 2 years after Susan's disappearance, police executed a search warrant on Stephen Powell's home. The warrant was related to the Susan Powell investigation, but what they found inside that house opened an entirely new dimension of horror. Stephen Powell had thousands of images, photographs and videos, voyeuristic recordings, hidden cameras, images of neighborhood women taken without their knowledge or consent, and images of Susan. Stephen Powell had been secretly recording his daughter-in-law for years. Private moments that she never knew were being captured. He kept them organized, cataloged, labeled with dates. Among the materials seized from Stephen Powell's home, investigators found deeply disturbing content that represented a separate category of criminal behavior. Stephen Powell was arrested. He was charged with voyeurism. He was later convicted and sentenced. And here is what that arrest meant for the case. With Stephen Powell in custody and his house now a crime scene, Josh Powell could no longer live there. And more importantly, the arrest of his father on such serious charges triggered a custody review for Charlie and Braden. The state of Washington began proceedings to evaluate whether Josh Powell should retain custody of his sons. A guardian ad litem was appointed. Psychological evaluations were ordered. Social workers entered the picture. And this is where the machinery of justice began to show its cracks. Josh was ordered to undergo a psychosexual evaluation as part of the custody proceedings. This is a standard procedure in cases where a parent is closely associated with someone convicted of serious offenses. The evaluation would include a polygraph examination. Josh refused. He didn't refuse outright at first. He delayed. He rescheduled. He raised objections through his attorney. He challenged the scope of the evaluation. He challenged the qualifications of the evaluator. He did everything a person does when they know that a test will reveal something they cannot afford to have revealed. The court waited. The court gave extensions. The court demonstrated patience that, in retrospect, looks less like fairness and more like a fatal hesitation. While Josh played his legal chess game, Charlie and Braden were placed in the custody of Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox. The boys went to live with their grandparents. For the first time since Susan disappeared, they were in a home where someone loved them without conditions, without performance, without the constant recalibration of a man managing his own alibi. And in that safety, the boys began to talk more. The things Charlie said to his grandmother Judy would later be documented in court filings. He talked about the camping trip. He talked about what happened before they left the house. He talked about mommy going night-night. He said things that a 7-year-old should never have to carry inside his head. Judy Cox reported everything to the police. The police documented it. The social workers documented it. The court was informed. Josh was granted supervised visitation. Supervised, meaning a court-appointed social worker would be present at every visit. Josh was not allowed to be alone with his children. The social worker assigned to manage these visits was a woman named Elizabeth Griffin Hall. She was experienced, she was careful, and she was growing increasingly alarmed. Elizabeth filed reports. She documented Josh's behavior during visits. She noted that he was controlling with the boys. She noted that he asked them pointed questions about what they'd told their grandparents. She noted that his demeanor shifted when the boys mentioned Susan. Elizabeth recommended that Josh's visitation be further restricted. She put her concerns in writing. She submitted them through the proper channels. The court considered her recommendations. The court weighed the evidence. The court decided to continue supervised visitation. The system was working. Slowly, carefully, with all the caution that American family courts bring to custody cases, the system was processing the information and moving toward a decision. But the system moves at the speed of paperwork, and Josh Powell was operating on a different clock. February 5, 2012, a Sunday, Graham, Washington. Josh had rented a house specifically for his supervised visits with the boys. It was a modest, single-story home on a dead-end road. Nothing remarkable about it from the outside. Elizabeth Griffin Hall arrived with Charlie and Braden at approximately 12:05 in the afternoon. This was routine. She would bring the boys to the house, supervise the visit, and return them to Chuck and Judy Cox afterward. She pulled into the driveway. Charlie and Braden were in the back seat. They were excited. Despite everything, they were excited to see their father. They were 7 and 5 years old. They loved their dad. Children do that. They love their parents even when their parents don't deserve it. The boys got out of the car and ran to the front door. Josh opened the door. The boys went inside. Elizabeth walked up to the door behind them. She was perhaps 10 steps behind the boys. Josh closed the door in her face. Elizabeth heard the lock engage. She knocked. She called out. She identified herself as the court-appointed supervisor. She reminded Josh that the visitation was supervised, that she was required to be present, that closing the door was a violation of the court order. No response. And then she smelled gasoline. Elizabeth Griffin Hall immediately called 911. The call was logged at 12:08 p.m. What happened during that 911 call would later become one of the most scrutinized pieces of audio in American true crime history. Elizabeth told the dispatcher that she had been locked out, that she was the social worker for a supervised visit, that the father had taken the children inside and locked the door, that she could smell gasoline. The dispatcher asked clarifying questions. Elizabeth repeated herself. She said gasoline. She said children were inside. She said the father was a person of interest in a missing persons case. The dispatcher categorized the call. There is a recording of this call, and I will tell you what is on it because it matters. It matters because every second of that recording represents a choice, and every choice represents a failure. Elizabeth told the dispatcher she could smell gas. The dispatcher asked if this was a prior arrangement, meaning, was the visit scheduled? Elizabeth said yes, it was a court-ordered visit. The dispatcher asked if there were weapons involved. Elizabeth said she didn't know. The dispatcher said they would send someone. Elizabeth said she needed someone there now. The dispatcher said they would send a unit, not a priority response, not an emergency dispatch, a unit. As though a court-appointed social worker calling to report that a person of interest in a disappearance case had locked himself inside a house with 2 children and the smell of gasoline was pouring through the walls was a matter that could wait for the next available officer. 6 minutes after that 911 call, the house exploded. Not caught fire, exploded. Josh Powell had prepared. He had purchased 2 5-gallon containers of gasoline before the visit. He had distributed the fuel throughout the house. He had a plan. And the plan was not to hide, not to run, not to negotiate. The plan was total destruction. When fire crews arrived, the house was fully engulfed. The heat was so intense that firefighters could not enter the structure. By the time the flames were controlled, there was almost nothing left. Josh Powell was gone. Charlie Powell was gone. Braden Powell was gone. The medical examiner's report would later reveal that Josh had attacked the boys with a weapon before the fire. The gasoline and the explosion were the final act, but not the first. He harmed his children before ending their lives. He made a choice, in those last minutes, to ensure that if he could not have them, no one would. 7 years old, 5 years old, Elizabeth Griffin Hall stood in the driveway and watched the house burn. She had done everything right. She had recognized the danger. She had called for help. She had been told help was coming. Help came too late. Not because the fire department was slow, because the 911 system treated a social worker's urgent warning as a routine call, because the dispatcher did not escalate, because the protocol did not account for the possibility that a man who had already committed one terrible act might commit another in the time it takes to fill out a dispatch form. And now I need to take you back. Back to December 6th, 2009. Back to the beginning. Because you need to understand what happened to Susan before you can understand the full weight of what happened to her sons. Here is what the evidence tells us. On the evening of December 6th, 2009, Susan Powell was at home on Sarah Circle in West Valley City, Utah. The boys were there. Josh was there. It was a Sunday. Susan had attended church that morning. She had made dinner. By all accounts, the evening proceeded normally until it didn't. At some point that evening, between approximately 9 p.m. and midnight, something happened inside that house. The forensic evidence points to a confrontation. The wet carpet, the cleaning, the fans, the luminol reaction pattern suggesting that a biological substance consistent with blood had been present on the living room floor and was cleaned before police arrived. Josh loaded the boys into the minivan. Not one trip, multiple trips, back and forth between the house and the vehicle, as the neighbor observed. He put the children in the van, and he drove south into the Utah desert in sub-zero temperatures. Cell phone data tracked his movement toward the Simpson Springs area, then went dark when the battery was removed. When the phone came back online, the route showed deviations, unexplained stops, extra miles, time unaccounted for. There are abandoned mine shafts in the desert south of Salt Lake City. Some of them descend hundreds of feet. Some of them have never been fully mapped. Some of them have openings just wide enough for a person, but too narrow for recovery equipment. Search teams investigated multiple mines. They used rope systems, robotic cameras, sonar. In some shafts they found items of interest. In one they found material that warranted further investigation. But the shafts are deep and dangerous, and the recovery efforts were limited by technology, funding, and the sheer geology of the Utah desert. Susan's body has never been found. Never. Not a bone, not a tooth, not a fiber of clothing. The desert took her, or a mine shaft took her, or Josh Powell disposed of her remains in a way that the most extensive search operation in Utah's recent history could not reverse. What the investigation did establish, through the cumulative weight of circumstantial evidence, was this. Josh Powell took his wife's life. He did it inside the house on Sarah Circle. He cleaned up afterward. He loaded his children, his 2 sleeping toddlers, into a van and drove into the desert, in the middle of the night, in the middle of winter. He disposed of Susan's remains in a location that has never been identified. He drove home. He turned on the fans, and he waited for someone to notice that his wife was gone. He waited. He didn't call the police. He didn't call her friends. He didn't call her parents. He took the boys to daycare, went about his morning, and waited for someone else to sound the alarm. Giovanna Owings did that. Susan's co-worker, the person who actually noticed. the person who actually cared enough to pick up the phone. Josh Powell was never charged with Susan's disappearance. Never. Not once. The West Valley City Police Department wanted to charge him. The detectives who worked the case believed they had enough circumstantial evidence to bring it to a grand jury. But the district attorney's office in Salt Lake County made a calculation. Without a body, without a murder weapon, without a confession, the risk of acquittal was too high. And an acquittal would mean double jeopardy. One shot. That's all you get. If you charge a man and a jury says not guilty, you cannot charge him again. Ever. Even if Susan's body surfaces the next day, even if new evidence emerges, even if he confesses on national television, not guilty means not guilty, and the law does not allow a second attempt. So the prosecutors waited. They waited for the body. They waited for the forensic breakthrough. They waited for the piece of evidence that would push the case from everyone knows to everyone can prove. That evidence never came. And while the prosecutors waited, Josh Powell was raising the two witnesses who might have held the key to everything. Charlie and Braden, two boys who were in that minivan on December 6, 2009. Two boys who may have seen what their father did. Two boys whose memories, fragmented and childlike and developing, were the closest thing to a living testimony that the investigation would ever have. Charlie was 4 when it happened. By the time the custody battle reached its peak, he was 7. Old enough to form sentences, old enough to describe events, old enough to draw pictures that made grown investigators leave the room. A child's memory is not a video recording. It's impressionistic. It stores feelings, images, fragments. A 4-year-old who witnesses something terrible does not store a prosecutable narrative. He stores fear. He stores confusion. He stores the image of his mother lying down in the back of a van. And that is exactly what Charlie stored. The things Charlie said to his grandmother, to his daycare workers, to the social workers who interviewed him, those statements were documented. They were consistent across multiple tellings. The core details did not change, which is significant because children who fabricate stories tend to alter details with each retelling, while children who are describing actual memories maintain the central elements even as peripheral details shift. Charlie remembered going in the van. Charlie remembered Mommy being in the van. Charlie remembered Mommy not waking up. Charlie drew the picture, the van with 4 people, 3 sitting up, 1 lying down. These statements could not be used to charge Josh Powell. But they could have been used, eventually, in a custody proceeding, to permanently sever Josh's parental rights. And Josh knew that. He knew that the longer the boys lived with Chuck and Judy Cox, the more they would say, the more they would remember, the more the truth would surface through the cracked and imperfect vessel of a child's recollection. Every day that Charlie and Braden spent in safety was a day that Josh Powell's control over the narrative eroded. Every bedtime story, every breakfast conversation, every quiet moment when a child feels safe enough to say the thing he's been holding inside, those were threats. Not to the boys, to Josh. And that is the key to understanding February 5th, 2012. It was not an act of desperation. It was not a man snapping under pressure. It was a calculated decision by a man who had already demonstrated his capacity for calculation. He rented the house. He purchased the gasoline. He planned the timing. He knew exactly when Elizabeth Griffin Hall would arrive with the boys. He knew exactly how long it would take between the moment he closed that door and the moment first responders could arrive. He did the math, and the math worked in his favor, because the system gave him the time he needed. The supervised visitation order gave him access. The 911 response protocol gave him minutes, and those minutes were enough. I need to talk about that 911 call because it represents something larger than one dispatcher's failure. It represents a system designed for categories, not for emergencies that don't fit neatly into boxes. When Elizabeth Griffin Hall called 911, She described a situation that did not match any standard dispatch category. It wasn't a burglary. It wasn't a domestic violence call in progress. It wasn't a fire, not yet. It was a social worker reporting that a door had been locked and she could smell gasoline. The dispatcher heard the words but did not hear the context, or heard the context but could not translate it into the urgency code that would have triggered an immediate response. The system requires classification: priority 1, priority 2, priority 3. Each classification triggers a different response time. Elizabeth's call was not classified as the highest priority. The unit was dispatched, but not at emergency speed, not with lights and sirens, not with the understanding that behind that locked door, a man was pouring gasoline on the floor, while his 7-year-old and 5-year-old sons stood in the room. After the fire, after the investigation, after the public outcry, the Pierce County 911 system underwent a review. Protocols were examined, the recording was analyzed. The dispatcher was not publicly disciplined, but the system was changed. New training was implemented, new categories were created. But new categories don't bring back the dead, they only prevent the next failure. Maybe. If someone is listening, let me tell you about the aftermath, because the aftermath is where the weight of this case settles, and it never lifts. Chuck and Judy Cox buried their grandsons. They held a funeral for 2 boys whose mother's funeral they had never been able to hold, because there was no body to bury, no remains to honor, no grave to visit. They buried Charlie and Braden next to an empty plot. The empty plot is for Susan. It's been waiting since 2009. It may wait forever. Chuck Cox became an advocate. He testified before the Washington State Legislature about failures in the custody system. He pushed for reforms in how family courts handle cases involving persons of interest in violent crimes. He spoke calmly, clearly, with the kind of precision that comes from a man who has thought about every sentence before he says it, because saying it wrong means feeling it all over again. Judy Cox spoke less publicly but no less powerfully. She described what it was like to tuck Charlie into bed at night and hear him say things about his mother that no grandmother should have to process. She described the joy of having the boys safe, finally safe, and the hole that opened on February 5, 2012, that would never close. Stephen Powell, Josh's father, was convicted of voyeurism in 2012. He served time. In 2018, while awaiting a new trial on separate charges, he died in a hospice facility. He never publicly acknowledged what his son had done. He never expressed remorse. He went to his death maintaining that Josh was innocent. The Powell family, Josh's siblings, scattered in the aftermath. Some maintained Josh's innocence, others distanced themselves. The family fractured along the same lines that had been invisible before December 2009 and undeniable after February 2012. The West Valley City Police Department has never closed the Susan Powell case. It remains officially open. Detectives have retired, been reassigned, moved on, but the file remains active. Periodically, new technology prompts new searches. Ground-penetrating radar improves. Mineshaft exploration techniques advance. Someone proposes a new location, a new theory, a new method. And each time, the same result: nothing. Susan Powell is out there, somewhere in the Utah desert, or somewhere that no one has thought to look. And she has been out there since December 6th, 2009, and every passing year makes it less likely that she will ever be found. I want to return to where we started, the journal. Susan's journal was not a cry for help in the way we usually think of that phrase. It was not a desperate scrawl on a bathroom mirror. It was a deliberate, organized, thoughtful document, created by a woman who understood her situation with total clarity. She knew Josh was dangerous. She wrote it down. She knew that if something happened to her, Josh would be the reason. She wrote that down. She knew that the system she lived in, the courts, the police, the church community, the family structure, might not protect her. So she created a record, a paper trail, a voice that would survive her. And that voice did survive. The journal was found. It was read. It was entered into evidence. It was discussed in court proceedings. It was cited in custody evaluations. It was quoted in news reports. Everyone read it. Everyone understood it. And Susan still disappeared. And her sons still perished. The journal did exactly what Susan designed it to do. It told the truth after she could no longer tell it herself. But telling the truth and being heard are not the same thing. And being heard and being protected are not the same thing. And being protected and being saved are not the same thing. Susan Powell did everything right. She documented the danger. She consulted a lawyer. She planned an exit. She updated her will. She wrote the warning. She did everything that every domestic violence advocate, every safety pamphlet, every hotline operator tells you to do. And she is gone. And her boys are gone. And Josh Powell never spent a single day in a prison cell. The system had the information. The system had the journal. The system had the children's statements. The system had the forensic evidence. The system had the social workers' warnings. The system had every red flag that exists in the catalog of red flags. And the system moved at the speed of paperwork, while a man moved at the speed of gasoline and a match. This is not a story about a mystery. There is no mystery here. Everyone knows what Josh Powell did. The police know. The prosecutors know. Chuck and Judy Cox know. The neighbors know. The daycare workers who heard Charlie's words know. This is a story about the distance between knowing and acting, between evidence and justice, between a warning written in a journal and a system capable of responding to that warning before it's too late. Susan wrote, quote, 6. The system read those words. The system filed those words. The system referenced those words in court documents. The system treated those words with the gravity and solemnity that the American legal system brings to all pieces of evidence. And then, the system watched Susan's children walk through a door that locked behind them. And the system dispatched a unit, not a priority response. A unit. I'm Miles GhostHunter. Susan Powell disappeared on December 6, 2009. Her body has never been found. Her sons, Charlie and Braden, were taken on February 5, 2012. They were 7 and 5 years old. There is an empty plot in a cemetery in Puyallup, Washington. It has Susan's name on it. It has been empty for 15 years. And a journal sits in an evidence locker in Utah. Its pages contain the truth, the whole truth. Written in the hand of a woman who knew exactly what was coming. She warned them. She warned them. Nobody listened.